But David Cameron thinks he's won the biggest prize, knocking out the idea of a second question offering another option, devolution max, just short of independence. David Cameron thought that was Alex Salmond's wheeze, to try and make sure that even if he didn't get full independence, Scotland would have made a giant leap in that direction. David Cameron wanted to kill it off, and that's what he's done.
Now it seems you are offering, effectively, the voters a chance to vote yes or for Devo Max.
The equivalent of what Keir Hardie was asking for when he called for home rule for Scotland.
Now the question is whether Devo Max represents the best shelter for Scottish people from the powerful winds that are buffeting all of us from the global economy.
So a no vote actually means faster, fairer, safer and better change.
They suddenly thought, having laughed at the referendum idea, because it was clearly going to be a no, they suddenly thought in the last couple of weeks it might slip away, and then panic set in the BBC newsroom, as it did in the UK government. Not because of I understand, because of a published opinion poll, but because they did their private polling, which actually put yes at one point at 54%, and that's when they said, oh shit.
New sort of Devo Max package being offered to Scots if they vote no. The Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives have clearly indicated they will back it.
Extra powers may not be on the ballot paper, but they are on the table.
That sort of power is the sort of power that actually most federal governments in Western Europe, for example, simply don't have.
There is super Devo on the table now.
Real change is Scotland's for the taking.
My research casts doubt on the impartiality of, in particular, BBC coverage of the referendum. Well, in the last few weeks, especially after the one poll which suggested a yes lead of 51%, and the flurry of activity by politicians arriving in Scotland, the coverage at that point, BBC went into full propaganda mode, comparable to the period in 2003 when their coverage was designed largely to support the decision to go to war in Iraq. On the 11th in particular, the day that the three leaders came up, I noted a 2-to-1 ratio of bias in the BBC reporting that evening, and a very, very heavy tendency to conflate the Yes campaign with the single figure of Alex Salmond, a figure that they feel, I think, in some ways can be undermined, and then by association the Yes campaign can be undermined. I think there were 14 references to Alex Salmond wanting this and wanting that, discussing that, and no references at all to the Yes campaign. 1 million people largely signed up to the Yes campaign, but not referred to directly. There was a possibility of a Yes win. I mean, we saw the sudden arrival of three politicians, the cancellation of question time in London, but most interesting was the BBC coverage of that, which took it entirely uncritically.
And Gordon Brown's obviously been playing a much bigger role in this campaign in the last week or so than he did at the beginning.
At last, the world is hearing the voices of the real people of Scotland.
Gave massive attention to Gordon Brown, despite the fact that the offer was on the one hand illegal. It was contrary to the Edinburgh Agreement that the parties could change anything in the last month, I think, of campaigning. It was illegal in the sense that about 700,000 people had already voted by post. The McCalman Commission had indicated that it was unworkable already. None of this was covered by the BBC, largely giving a kind of cheerleading approach to the whole thing, accepting Gordon Brown as the representative of the union, despite the fact that he's a backbencher with no executive status, no executive role whatsoever. How would you interpret that particular performance? I don't think it's possible to argue that people like Gordon Brown are in a scheming Machiavellian way lying directly to the audience. I think they believe their own script.
Everything suddenly went into overdrive, and you suddenly had this very troubling situation where ultimately every daily newspaper was running headlines on a daily basis which were extremely hysterical, which presented an extremely negative view of the consequences of voting yes, and not a negative view of the consequences of voting yes which was rational and was looking at risks further down the line. It was saying if you vote yes, these massive dire economic consequences are going to happen very shortly afterward.
He has fought the independence fight for decades. As Alex Salmond claws to within inches of achieving it, so an increasing number of opponents clamour to pull him back.
Galvanise leading business people.
Now Deutsche Bank has weighed in, likening the potential fallout from an independence vote to America's Great Depression.
It was for Britain a political crisis that it didn't expect and it didn't see coming, and so there was this panic. And I think the results of that panic are still with us today. They're extremely negative, they're extremely problematic. And I think that level of consensus in the press is an extremely negative thing, and it really does show the need for greater diversity and a greater range of perspectives.
It's been a week of bleak headlines and dire warnings from big business. Banks said they'd move south, retailers said prices would go up, and now another, possibly the most pessimistic of all.
It would be quite catastrophic economically for Scotland, bordering on the possibility of a depression in Scotland that would last for a number of years.
I mean, a lot of the No campaign coming from England in particular laughed at Scotland. It scorned Scotland.
This is a disastrous path for Scotland, particularly their financial and banking sector.
Indeed, Mr. Speaker.
I mean, when you have members of Parliament standing up and saying, is it not true that Scotland would be bankrupt if it was independent? Forgetting we've got Ireland, Switzerland, Denmark, Finland, Norway, a host of countries. Malta, for God's sake. They have no perspective at all of a global world. All they think of is in terms of the UK. And it's we, Scotland, we're subsidised. Well, we must be, because they're more powerful than we are. And a lot of Scots, I think, as the ones I was talking about, the assimilators who buy that idea and don't have the courage to stand up and say it's not true. And then there's the rest of us who think this is baloney. And frankly, if it is true we're subsidised, I don't want your charity. I want to stand on my own 2 feet. That's what independence for Scotland means.
The Deutsche Bank report also said that companies and Scottish shoppers would stop spending due to the uncertainty of a yes vote. That was echoed by a letter from large retailers including B&Q and Marks & Spencer's, who warned today that families would have to spend even more on their weekly shop as prices would rise.
When we were told you can't use the pound, prices are going to go up in your supermarkets. I mean, for me, the picture that really sums up the Labour Party in the referendum was Joanne Lamont standing outside a supermarket with a big grin on her face when the supermarket bosses, at the behest of David Cameron, had announced that prices were going to go up if Scotland voted yes. And the fact that they took such unseemly glee in what they perceived to be the inadequacies of Scotland, and these inadequacies were inadequacies that they had caused, that really turned my stomach, because I kept saying to myself, fine, okay, if we accept your argument, if we accept the unionist argument that Scotland is a complete and utter basket case, this country has an embarrassment of natural resources. It's embarrassing how much natural wealth Scotland has got. We've got a highly educated English-speaking population. We've got 4 of the best universities in the world. We have solidly democratic traditions. We have no territorial disputes. We are in a geopolitically stable and quiet part of the world. This is, if you wanted to have a recipe for a stable, prosperous and peaceful independent nation, Scotland is it. Yet, apparently, according to the unionists, we are such a basket case that we would be the only country in the world that was unable to have a currency. So whose fault is that then? Whose fault is that for doing that? That's the logic of your own argument.
Over the past week, some of Britain's largest companies, many of whom are based here, have warned of the dire economic consequences of a yes vote. They won't decide the matter. People of Scotland will do that on Thursday, and everyone will have to live with it.
They were able to engage the institutions. I mean, big business was, they were whipped in by the Prime Minister, remember. They were told, you've got to speak up. And they gave statements that were very equivocal, but were immediately interpreted by the unionist media as being, we will be leaving Scotland, thousands of jobs will go. And afterwards said, oh no, we didn't mean that. That's not what we were talking about at all. But equally, you have to remember that big power blocks, for example, the EU, are not by and large interested in fragmentation. I mean, they will nurse little countries like Kosovo along. They don't want to see, you know, Corsica or, you know, who knows, Wales, Scotland, Catalonia. They don't want to break up the states. The EU is a club of member states. Big states, for the most part, are the ones who hold all the power.
The application and the accession to the European Union will have to be approved by all the other member states of the European Union.
So countries like Spain, who've got their own secessionist issues as well.
I think it will be, I don't want to interfere, I repeat, on your referendum here and your discussion, democratic discussion here, but of course it will be extremely difficult to get the approval of all the other member states to have a new member coming from one member state. We have seen,
and so, you know, you get some corrupt politicians, people who will say and do anything, like Barroso, who lied through his teeth, in my view, and we should never be forgotten by Scots for what he did, nor indeed should the EU for the way it behaved over Scotland's independence campaign. Those people stand up and say, no, you'll not get in the EU, without a single piece of institutional or treaty justification for it. There's no evidence for that at all. But it gives you a great headline. The boss of the EU says no to Scotland.
It was naive to expect that we were going to get a fair shake of the stick from the BBC. That was never ever going to happen. So we might have won the face-to-face campaign, but we lost in the broadcast media. And for all the people talk about the new media and the internet, there's still vast numbers of people that it doesn't reach, and there's still fairly or unfairly, probably unfairly, I would say, that people tend to have a hierarchy of trust with news sources, and so the phrase "I read it on the internet" implies a lack of credibility, which "I read it in a newspaper" doesn't imply, even though newspapers are notoriously inaccurate, So we had that to overcome. We had to create an alternative Scottish media from scratch, and I think the independence campaign certainly showed that we could do that. So we're far, far better off now than we were, a couple of years ago.
Let's just say, for argument's sake, that Scotland's never going to become an independent country. I mean, I personally think that it will, but if Scotland's going to be a country which has some measure of autonomy, has its own parliament, has its own autonomy in a whole set of different areas, it needs to have much greater autonomy over its media. And that was something that you saw in really extreme terms, I think, during the referendum. But actually, it is about a longer term problem which goes back much further.
Why should a Scottish voter believe you, a politician, against men who are responsible for billions of pounds of profits?
Nick, the corporation tax does not depend on registered office, but on economic activity.
He didn't answer.
Our estimates on corporation tax for Scotland at the present moment don't include the profits of NatWest or any of the Royal Bank's operations anywhere else in the UK.
He didn't answer.
The BBC has never really been quite comfortable and never quite understood how to cope and how to understand Scottish nationalism as a movement. It's almost like the issue of independence is like a bit of code that just the BBC as an organisation can't translate and understand.
It's not a matter of operations or jobs, it is a technical matter in the opinion of the Chief Executive of the Royal Bank of Scotland.
He didn't answer, but he did attack the reporting of those in what he called the metropolitan media.
Even if we weren't in a referendum campaign, even if there weren't Purdah rules which are meant to apply to government, the briefing of market-sensitive information is as serious a matter as you possibly can get.
Now that has gone up another level by this accusation from Alex Salmond that, in effect, the Treasury deliberately leaked the information about RBS to journalists last night, basically to unsettle the nationalist camp to basically undermine the nationalist case. Now, speaking to folk in the Treasury, they vehemently deny this. They describe Mr. Salmon's claims as, quotes, absurd, a desperate distraction tactic. Their version of events is that they were contacted last night by journalists who were asking the Treasury about a statement put out by Lloyds Bank, who had indicated they were going to relocate their legal home. And in the context of that conversation, questions were asked about RBS, to which the Treasury responded. In other words, the Treasury version of events is, we didn't put this out here in the public domain. It was journalists who started it, journalists who asked the questions, and that is how the information came about.
As I understand it, the Treasury were responding directly to media requests, and they were responding to them with the best of the knowledge that they had. The Sun newspaper had already...
Well, just for the record, I received that email and I didn't request it.
Well...
And therefore I know the BBC, in its impartial role as a public sector broadcaster, will give full cooperation to that investigation.
We must have control of broadcasting. I keep banging on about this. People were comparing the turnout, for example, and there was the rally for independence in Edinburgh, and there was like 30,000 people or whatever were there, and that was being contrasted with what was going on in Catalonia, where you'd have 1 million people turning out for a demonstration. I mean, there are cultural differences in terms of participation in outdoor events. Obviously, we don't have the weather for it, whereas they do in Catalonia. But the crucial difference is, in Catalonia, they've got 5 TV channels purely of their own. They've got 5 national TV channels in Catalonia. We get Reporting Scotland. And in Catalonia, when there's going to be a major high-profile pro-independence event, it is advertised in advance in the Catalan media.
I entremig dels milers de persones, diverses mostres de cultura popular catalana com aquests grallers que han fet una mica més amena l'espera i sobretot la calor. Jordi Gil, TV3, Barcelona.
Whereas in Scotland, the BBC barely mentioned the Rally for Independence after it had happened. They certainly never mentioned it before. So people never had the opportunity to find out that it was going to happen and to participate in it. So, I mean, that's just one small example, but we have to have a Scottish media. We have to have a Scottish media which actually represents the breadth of opinion in this country.
Здравствуйте, на канале ГРТ информационный выпуск Аберляр. В студии Михаил Резунец. Коротко в этом выпуске.
It scunners me immensely. Not that I've got anything against this particular small country. There's a place called Gagauzia, which has a population of about 140,000, approximately the same as Aberdeen. It is in the poorest corner of the poorest country in Europe. It's an autonomous region of Moldova, inhabited by 140,000 Christian Turkish speakers, the Gagauzi people. They have control of broadcasting. Now, if 140,000 people in the poorest corner of the poorest country in Europe can have control of broadcasting, why can't Scotland? It's got nothing to do with money and everything to do with politics. So when they tell us that, oh no, it's just completely unreasonable for Scotland to have its own broadcasting, they're really talking absolute nonsense. The reason that the Unionists don't want Scotland to have control of broadcasting is because when there is a rerun of the independence campaign, they want complete and utter domination of the airwaves like they had before, because that's what won it for them.
Всего доброго.